Story 1. It absolutely should be working class versus the elites, but the state of things right now, it will not be for a very long time. There's too much disinformation and resentment for us to unite as the people against the elites. Story 2. I promise this is an answer to your question. I am not a conspiracy theorist, however. I am a strong believer that the United States government, which was confirmed to have been spying and regularly attempted to silence Martin Luther King Jr. through blackmail, facilitated or actively conducted the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. following the turn of the civil rights movements from the racial divide of America into the classist segregation of the United States due to the capitalist system. Let us be dissatisfied until the tragic walls that separate the outer city of wealth and comfort from the inner city of poverty and despair shall be crushed by the battering rams of the forces of justice. Following the Civil Rights Act being signed in 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. remained a prominent figure in civil rights and continued to advocate for Black Americans in the years following. Martin Luther King Jr. was deemed a radical by the United States government and regularly and actively engaged in public discourse to support the transition into civil rights and the application of civil rights laws throughout, but predominantly in the southern United States. However, while already radical, in 1967 and 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. became increasingly vocal about the impacts of classism on the racist structure. There are inklings of it in his earlier speeches, but after 2 years post-Civil Rights Act, Martin Luther King Jr. had become more and more vocal that the state of the American Negro would not be improved purely with civil rights but until the capitalist system that dominated the United States had been fully deconstructed. Subjugated and oppressed people could not flourish in a system that was designed to keep them in poverty. Racism had been a tool for whites to oppress and subjugate blacks and keep them in poverty, but classism and capitalism were tools to keep people in poverty. It was at this point that Martin Luther King Jr. realized that his dream of America would not be realized until there was fundamental change to the American system, and he made that very well known. And then he was assassinated. It was never Republican versus Democrat. It was always rich versus poor. The distinction between the average Republican and Democrat up until the last 15-ish years was largely about what economic system they believed would personally benefit them, and some social values, and it was not uncommon for voters to split their tickets. The cultural divide that has manifested in recent history between them has been a tool for the elite to degrade a unified distrust of the ruling class. Look at the Republican Party right now that has leveraged its constituency's fear of cultural items to allow two men that spit in the face of some of their core party beliefs to rule over them. Look at the Democratic Party that has embedded hysteria into its constituency to absolve themselves of the responsibility to actually take action. This is because the Democratic and Republican elite belong to the same ruling class. One of the greatest civil rights leaders the world has ever seen knew 70 years ago that it was rich versus poor, that capitalism was destroying the common American, and that we would suffer due to the greed and selfishness of the rich. Story 3. The rich of old were quiet. After a few revolutions in Europe where they were literally guillotined, they agreed to not be so greedy. This new rich group of billionaires who don't understand the delicacies and intricacies of enjoying their wealth while keeping the poor happy are the problem. They want to amass more and more wealth. What they fail to realize is that they are not all-powerful, and there are millions of us for every one of them, and a new revolution will come. Luigi Mangione is the first, but there will be others. Story 4. Kinda still thinking it's Republicans versus Democrats, though, because the Democrats aren't trying to take away the shot that literally sustains my life because it's termed gender-affirming care. And without it, I will die, and the Republicans are. By the way, there are about 1.2 million people that a national ban would endanger, as their only crime wouldn't be cutting anything off. It would be being born different. In short, gender-affirming care isn't elective for everyone. Thank you, this has been my TED Talk. Story 5. It's always been rich versus poor. The 1% are just trying to speedrun this to the endgame now after they're done obliterating the middle class. I imagine once they purge and control the military, that's when they'll have no use for your average Republican puppet anymore. And that's when they'll really hurt all of us with no real way to fight back. Story 6. It's always been about rich versus poor. They love distracting us with the same 5 topics every election, and people eat it right up with nothing really changing. Story 7. 2 things can be true at the same time. There is no need to pick one or the other. It is a false premise. Democrat versus Republican is important. There are definite and stark contrasts between the two in the way they believe the government should function, how they view human rights pertaining to women and minorities and people of other religions, and their belief in the rule of law as a governing principle. Rich versus poor is and will always be an ongoing struggle. While both parties work with the rich, only one of the parties actively advocates for policies and laws that are beneficial to the poor at the expense of the rich. They don't do it as much as I would like, but they are clearly better on things like union rights, worker protections, and social safety nets, as well as things like tax rates and enforcement. The place to drive that party to be better is during the primaries. Once the general election hits, your options are realistically limited due to the nature of how the math of our election system works. You pick the better of two options or you get stuck with the worse of two options. Anyone saying they are exactly the same is lying to you or horribly uninformed. Story 8. Rich connected versus poor unconnected is the Republican Party in a nutshell for the past few decades. As long as the rich talk a good game, the poor will continue voting for the rich's interests. Story 9. The divide is asset versus effort. Is your primary source of income and financial stability due to the assets you own or the work you do? We need to tax those with assets and lower taxes on those producing things. Story 10. I think something worse has happened. It seems the ultra-rich have convinced the working and high school educated middle class that they are on the same side, and that it is the college-educated middle class that are their enemies. They are intentionally trying to use a wedge to prevent a coalition of these groups, which could almost certainly demand more accountability and concessions from the ultra-rich if they were to recognize their common adversary. Story 11. It's always been rich versus poor. It's just that now the few protections the poor have from exploitation by the rich are being openly stripped away so the rich can become even richer. Story 12. Left versus right has always been a distraction. The 1% want us quarreling amongst ourselves so that we cannot unite to stop them from running out the back door with all the money. Story 13. It's really only the left who has this view. Right-wingers are still completely leaning into the "it's Republicans versus Democrats, and my billionaire daddy oligarchs actually love me" thing. Story 14. I love it when right-wingers and centrists say this because the rich versus poor rhetoric is exclusively left-wing. Cognitive dissonance and stupidity at its finest. Story 15. It has never really been red versus blue. It always has been a class war, but Republicans are good at convincing some people that it was a culture war. They turned politics into a high school football rivalry, and now we are all losing. Story 16. This is a very populist perspective. Populist ideology promotes a worldview where the world is divided into the rich and normal people, and the relationship between the two is zero-sum. In reality, things are not so simple. There are many people who are in between rich and poor, and many cooperative non-zero-sum activities between people of all backgrounds, as well as incompetent negative-sum activities that hurt both parties. The voter base of the Republican Party has become more rural and less wealthy, and the Democratic voter base has become much more educated and wealthy. Historically, it was the other way around. I think wealth is not the major political divider it used to be. Education level is the new divider of United States politics. Story 17. The fundamental political schism in the 21st century is no longer right versus left, but the impulsive childish values of the right and left versus the compromising adolescent and adult values of both the right and left. It is no longer a debate of communism versus capitalism or freedom versus equality, but rather of maturity versus immaturity, of means versus ends. Story 18. It's always the rich Republicans versus the rich Democrats. Harris was able to raise $1 billion. Trump raised roughly $600 million. These donations were not from the middle class. Trump's rich donors were more outspoken, so everyone thinks the Republicans are the rich party. Story 19. Musk bought the presidency. That is just the most visible part of the problem. The biggest issue is that all Republican politicians are only interested in money and power. Story 20. Napoleon shot starving peasants with cannons and blew them to pieces. President Trump just quoted Napoleon. I promise he would shoot all the starving people of today if he could get them to stand in front of the White House. I honestly think that his plan is to murder protesters when they start showing up next month or later in the year. Story 21. Reddit is far too much of a cult to truly see this. Both sides create positions to divide people, which is why we don't have presidents whom both sides will vote for. Billionaires keep running things in the background and in our faces like Elon Musk. Story 22. The only thing about that title that's incorrect is the term no longer. The divide has always been between those who have and those who don't. It was just better hidden before. Story 23. It is way more than those two things. People are divided on a wide range of issues and have been polarized even more by social media that feeds into that dynamic. It is urban versus rural. It is secular versus religious. It is globalist versus isolationist. It is ethnicities against each other. And more. What you are seeing in politics reflects the fractionalization of America. And it is a huge thing. The political parties have catered to the extremists within them and have left the majority of people with no choice at all. States have redistributed for many reasons and made districts non-competitive, and hard left or right wins them. It hardens the divisions with people that do not accurately reflect what people believe. Most people are somewhere in between and do not get those choices because the people that vote are hard left and right in primaries. And then you hear political pundits pretend this is what they want. It is not. Want to change this. Get people to vote in primaries. It is what matters. Story 24. It has always been this man. Glad you're waking up to it, but it's been class war since feudal times. Workers' movements, collective bargaining, unions, socialism, communism, these are ideologies that focus on the well-being of people. We've just been propagandized our entire lives to reject things that would obviously benefit us dramatically, because they do not benefit the wealthy. Story 25. Politics feels less like left versus right and more like elite versus everyone else. Wealthy, connected individuals shape policy while regular people struggle. Party lines blur when power and influence control the game. Thoughts? Story 26. Also, religious authoritarian versus religious empathetic and non-religious empathetic. Having a debate currently with a religious authoritarian family member who opposes the government sending money to Mozambique to fight a sexually transmitted disease crisis because he thinks that's supporting sin and could not care less about the human suffering. Story 27. It's always been rich and powerful individuals versus everyone else. This whole Democrat versus Republican and conservative versus liberal dynamic is just a way to distract you and get you to choose a side. People in power pretty much exclusively abuse it for their benefit. We're in this situation because Americans believe the other group of power brokers are the good guys who are going to save them. Story 28. It's more the very elite and the very poor whites versus the upper middle and upper class, which tends to be more educated and is currently breaking towards Democrats. Story 29. I've been poor and I've been rich. I was poor because that's what I had when I started out. Through good planning, saving, and good investing, I became wealthy, only to be poor again in a couple of years. That continued to cycle 3 times before I actually figured out what worked for my lifestyle. In the beginning, I struggled as I lived off welfare. Now I make just over $400,000 per year, and that continues to climb every year. If I wasn't to plan, save, and invest wisely, I'd still be struggling and on welfare. Story 30. I think the rich Democrats still exist, but they are likely reeling it in for a few years. I can see them worried about themselves more now and less worried for the people they were trying to protect and help. Story 31. Sort of agree, but I do not agree at all with the unconnected part, as Republicans do a much better job of podcasting and pushing out right-wing content regularly on X, formerly known as Twitter and Truth Social. I cannot even think of a left-wing podcast. That does not mean they do not exist, but they are not nearly as popular as, say, Joe Rogan. Blue Sky also has not quite caught on very well. That being said, I also really hate how everyone has moved to their own echo chamber safe places. It makes all these current problems we are facing even more difficult to remedy. Story 32. The ultra-wealthy have always been corrupting and themselves corrupt. The majority of them steal from their employees in the form of low wages and wage theft. It has always been the wealthy versus the rest of us in America. They just don't care enough to hide it anymore. Story 33. It was always rich versus poor. The recent gender wars were sparked to divert attention away from the Occupy movement. Black versus white is a very serious issue, but it's secondary to rich versus poor. They killed Martin Luther King because he was teaching this. Story 34. Always has been. Normal autocracies split society along a horizontal line, with the rich on top and the poor below, and the conflict is between them. The poor, by sheer number, are always a danger in such cases. Democracy is a very efficient form of establishing autocracy because the divide stands vertically. Supporters of ruling elite flavor 1 and ruling elite flavor 2. The two groups fighting are not working class versus aristocracy but working class versus working class, divided along party lines. No one is left to endanger the ruling class in a democracy.